Hello everyone. Today I'm sharing this lovely little ladybird drawing in pastel pencils, and I wanted to use this piece to talk through some really useful realism tips, because even though it's a small subject, there is so much more we can learn from it. So at first glance it's a ladybird. It seems quite simple, right? Red shell, black spots, little legs. But actually once you start drawing it, you can quickly realise there's so much more going on. There's shine, there's reflected light, there's tiny details, strong darks, and that lovely rounded form of the shell. So this is a brilliant small study if you want to practice realistic drawing without that feeling of overwhelm. And if you've always wanted to create the animals and wildlife you love, please do consider following me, because that's exactly what I love helping people do. To really slow down, observe, and build realistic animal and wildlife art. So, moving on, one of the first tips with a subject like this is to maybe stop thinking in labels. Our brain loves labels, so it might be saying ladybird equals red and black. That's it. But if we draw it like that, obviously it can end up looking flat or a little bit cartoon like. So instead we want to ask better questions or different questions. So when you're looking at it and observing, ask yourself, where is the red warmer? Where is it darker? Where does it become more orange? Where is the shell catching the light? Where do the black spots look sharp? So those sort of questions. That is the difference between, just colouring something in and drawing it realistically. Red is not just red. On this little ladybird, on its shell, I'm looking for oranges, warm reds, deeper crimson tones, and sometimes cooler tones and colours, and also where the light is sort of reflecting differently. So that sort of variation, it helps what brings a shell to sort of look rounded and glossy. So if you're drawing along with something like this, you don't just reach for the one red pencil and use it everywhere. Choose a small colour family. So maybe a light orangey red for the first layer, a stronger red to build the main colour, a deeper red for the shadows, a muted colour such as grey, brown or an olive tone. That sort of calms down areas that may be feeling too bright. That's a really useful tip. Muted colours, they help bright colours look brighter. If the whole shell is equally bright, nothing will stand out. But when you have duller, darker areas beside those brighter reds, the shine can become more sort of realistic, more believable, I guess. So we're going to move on to layering and pressure. With pastel pencils, I like to build the colour gradually, especially on pastel mat. Pastel mat has a lovely grip to it, which means it holds the pastel and allows us to sort of layer, but we do still need to protect the tooth of the paper. The tooth is basically the texture of the surface, it's what grabs the pigment. If you press too hard too soon, you feel that texture quickly, and then it becomes much harder to add those more layers on top later. So in those early stages, keep your pressure light. Hold the pencil a little further back if you need to. Use the side of the pencil slightly for softer coverage, and don't worry if the first layer looks pale or unfinished. It's supposed to. It's just the foundation. I always think the first few layers are like building the map of the drawing. You're not just trying to finish it. You're simply placing colour, finding the main shapes, and giving yourself something to build on. So moving on to sort of highlights and shine, another important tip is to protect those highlights early. Because this ladybird shell is shiny, the highlights matter. Those small light areas will tell, the viewer that the surface is glossy and curved. if we cover them completely with strong red too early, it can be difficult to bring that brightness back. So I like to notice the light colours before I get too carried away with the main colour. You can draw carefully around them. You can lift gently with a putty rubber if the pastel is still light enough, or add a light pencil back over the top layer. But ideally, don't lose them completely. Shine's always really about contrast, so you need the bright lights, but you also need the darker values around them, or the main colour around them as well. If everything's sitting in the middle, the shell might look flat. But when you place a bright highlight next to a rich red or a darker spot, suddenly, it will start to feel glossy. And this applies also to so many subjects in wildlife art: eyes, nose, wet fur, glossy feathers. The light tells us what kind of surface we're drawing. So moving on to sort of the black pastel. Now, another big point with this ladybird is the black. Because the black spots are such a clear feature, it can be very tempting to put them in straight away, but black pastel can be a bit of a troublemaker if we're not careful. It can smudge very easily, especially onto bright reds and oranges. So I tend to be careful with when and how I add it. If I put the black in too early and then keep blending around it, I risk dragging that dark pigment into the shell and making everything muddy. So I'd rather build the red shell first, then place the black more intentionally once I know where everything's going. And even when I do add black, I don't always go straight in with the blackest black everywhere. You might see Payne's grey, dark indigo, cool grey, warm grey brown, or even tiny touches of blue where the light is catching. So if your black areas look a bit flat, try building them with a dark grey or dark blue first. Then add the strongest black only where you need the deepest value. That gives the dark areas more depth, and it also stops the drawing from becoming too heavy. So a really good beginner exercise is to ask yourself, where is the darkest dark? Not where is everything black, but where is the absolute deepest value? Then save your strongest black for those areas. That way your drawing has more range. And moving on to small details, when I'm working on the face and legs of the ladybird, I'm also thinking about scale. This is such a small drawing, so I'm not going to be able to include every tiny mark, and that's okay. One of the biggest lessons in realism is that you don't need to draw everything. You need to draw enough shape, enough value, enough light, enough texture. For tiny legs, claws and hairs, a few carefully placed marks can say more than trying to draw every little thing in. If you try to force too much detail in a small area, it can actually start to look a bit messy. So simplify. Look for the main dark shapes, then add the lighter bits, then add just a few tiny marks to suggest the hairs and the joints. And keep your pencil point fairly sharp at this point for those areas. It doesn't need to be needle sharp all the time, but for little legs, eyes and facial details, a better point gives you more control. So moving on to the tools. For blending, I like to choose the tool depending on what I need. So a blending stump can soften and push pastel into the paper. A finger can gently soften an area without moving it quite as much. And a colour shaper is useful when I want more control, especially around small details or edges. But here's an important tip. Keep wiping your tools. If you use a colour shaper or a blending stump in a dark area and then move straight into a bright red or a light highlight, for instance, you can drag that darker pigment across and dull the colour. So wipe your colour shaper often and be aware of what's already on your paper stump. That little habit can keep your colours much cleaner. I also like to use glassine under my hand when working with pastel, because pastel sits on the surface of the paper and it can smudge. So resting your hand directly on the drawing can lift or move the pigment, especially in the darker areas, whereas glassine will help protect the work as you go. A little bit about edges. Another helpful tip is to check your edges. Not every edge should be equally sharp. On the Ladybird, some edges will be crisp, especially around the eye spots or places where the form is clearly defined, but other edges may be softer, especially where light is reflecting. If every edge is hard, the drawing can look sort of cut out. But if every edge is soft, it can look blurry. So we want a balance. Sharp where it matters, softer where the form turns or disappears into shadow. Moving on to the shadow and the grounding. From an art point of view, the final thing that really helps this drawing is the shadow underneath. A shadow might seem like a small detail, but it can make a huge difference. Without it, the ladybird can look like it's floating. A good tip is to make the shadow darkest closest to the body and legs, then soften it as it moves away. Don't sort of outline the whole subject with shadow. Think about where the body is actually touching or blocking the light. That's where the shadow will be stronger. Then let it fade gently away. That simple soft shadow helps ground the drawing and it makes the whole piece feel more finished. So, although this is such a small ladybird study, look at how much it gives us to practice. So it's light pressure, layering, preserving the paper tooth, protecting highlights, building shine, using muted colours, controlling black pastel, simplifying tiny details, checking edges, and grounding the subject with shadow. That's why small drawings can be so valuable. They're not, they're not lesser than the big drawings. They're focused studies. They allow us to practice one or two important skills without the pressure of a huge piece. And if you're just starting out, I really encourage you to do more of these little studies. They build confidence, they help you learn faster, they remind you that drawing can be enjoyable, not just challenging. It's just fantastic to do small ones as well. So if you'd like to draw this ladybird with me in full, the complete real-time tutorial is available over on my Patreon. In that lesson you'll hear my thought process as I work through the drawing, the colours I choose, why I choose them, where I change my mind, how I adjust the layers, how I handle the tiny details, and how I decide when enough is enough. Because I think that's one of the most helpful things when you're learning, not just seeing what an artist does, but understanding why they do it. So if you've always wanted to create the animals and wildlife you love, please do follow me. I'll be sharing more realistic animal art tutorials, pastel pencil tips, drawing lessons and behind the scenes process videos as well. I hope this little ladybird encourages you to look more closely at the little creatures around us and to remember that even the smallest subject can teach us something valuable about colour, light and patience. Thank you so much for watching and I'll see you again soon. Bye for now.